Good evening and welcome back to The Drowsy Historian. This is the channel where history is told slow enough to fall asleep to. Tonight, you and I are going somewhere cold and quiet and stranger than almost anywhere else in American history. Before we begin, do me one small favor. Drop your city or your country in the comments along with your local time. It is always a comfort to see who else is drifting off around the world tonight. Now get yourself properly comfortable. Dim the lights if you have not already. Set your phone face down. Let the blanket settle around your shoulders. There is nothing you need to do for the rest of tonight except listen. And if these long, slow journeys through the past help you rest, consider subscribing so you never lose your way back here. One quiet click, and then we can forget all about it. Because tonight we are following the 15,000 workers who did something the finest minds of their century called impossible. They built a railroad across the entire American continent by hand, one hammer blow at a time. And to find them, we have to climb high into the Sierra Nevada mountains of California in the winter of 1867 to a place where an entire town of men lived buried beneath the snow. Listen, deep inside a mountain called Donner Summit, at an hour when the rest of America is asleep, there is a sound, a steady, patient ringing, steel against stone. It has not stopped in over a year. A man kneels at a wall of granite holding a long steel drill against a rock. His hands are wrapped in cloth. His breath hangs in the air. He gives the steel a small quarter turn and waits. Behind him, two of his crewmates swing 8-pound sledgehammers in a slow, careful rhythm. Strike, turn, strike, turn. They have done this for hours. Tonight, all that effort will win them a few more inches of tunnel. Now the drilling stops. The hole is deep enough. A charge is packed inside, tamped gently down, and a long fuse is uncoiled along the tunnel floor, out toward the darkness behind them. The foreman looks around once. He counts his men the way a schoolteacher counts children. Then he touches the fuse to a candle flame, and the little spark begins its journey into the mountain. Nobody runs. Running in a tunnel in the dark is how men get hurt. They walk quickly and calmly the way they have walked away from 1,000 other charges, counting their steps in the dark. And here is the strange part. When they step out of the tunnel mouth, they are still not outside. They walk into a corridor carved through solid snow, its walls glowing a soft, ghostly blue. Somewhere behind them, the mountain gives a long, low thump. The floor shivers. A little sift of snow drifts down from the ceiling like flour. The men barely glance back. That sound is just the day ending, because up on the surface there is nothing. No town, no lights, just wind and starlight and snow lying 40 feet deep over the highest pass in the Sierra Nevada. A silence so complete it presses on the ears. But underneath that silence, an entire settlement is breathing. Bunkhouses, kitchens, blacksmiths' shops, whole streets of them, buried to the chimney tops, connected by tunnels in the snow, warm and lamplit and very much alive. Thousands of men are down there. They will eat down there tonight and sleep down there and wake down there tomorrow and go back into the mountain, and most of them will not see open sky for weeks at a time. Here is what makes that ringing sound in the tunnel so remarkable. A few years earlier, the most respected engineers in the United States had studied these mountains and delivered their verdict. A railroad over the Sierra Nevada could not be built. The newspapers agreed. The financiers agreed. The granite was too hard, the grades too steep, the snow too deep. The whole idea, one rival put it, belonged to the world of dreams, not engineering. And yet, here, in the coldest winter anyone could remember, the impossible railroad was being built anyway. Not by machines. There were almost none. It was being built by roughly 15,000 workers, most of them young men from southern China. Men like the one you will spend tonight with. History did not record his name, but it recorded his days in wonderful detail. What he ate, what he was paid, how he worked and washed and rested and endured. So the question we will fall asleep to tonight is a simple one. How do you build something everyone says cannot be built with no machines to speak of through the worst mountains on the continent? The answer, it turns out, is slowly, beautifully, patiently, stubbornly, slowly. Here is how tonight will unfold. First, we will live one full day at Summit Camp from the moment the cook stirs the fire before dawn to the moment the last lantern goes out. We will go into the tunnel itself and learn why progress was measured in inches and meet the strange, dangerous liquid the crews mixed fresh on the mountain because no one dared carry it up. We will stay for the evening, for the hot baths and the dried oysters and the gambling games, and discover why these crews stayed healthier than any other workforce on the railroad. And then, once you are good and settled, we will pull back and watch the whole impossible story from the beginning. The race between two rival companies. A strike 3,000 strong. 10 miles of track laid in a single day. And a golden spike at the end of it. It is a story that begins with a country split in half by distance and ends with that distance collapsing from 6 months of hard travel to 7 days in a cushioned seat. But all of that can come later. For now, let the day begin gently. Close your eyes if they are ready to close. It is 4:30 in the morning at Summit Camp, and far beneath the snow a fire is being lit. You wake in darkness to the small iron sound of a stove door opening. Somewhere down the long room the cook is feeding the fire, and the smell of wood smoke drifts between the bunks. You lie still for one more minute, the way people have always lain still for one more minute. Under the blankets it is warm. Beyond them, the air is sharp enough to feel on your eyelids. Above the ceiling planks, there is no sky. There is snow packed 30 feet deep, and if you listen, you can hear it. Not a sound exactly, but a pressure, a great white weight leaning patiently on the roof. You dress the way everyone here dresses, quickly and in layers. Cotton, then wool, then the quilted jacket, then boots that spent the night close enough to the stove to stay soft. Around you, 12 men are doing the same. This is your gang, your crew. You came from villages within a few miles of each other in Guangdong in southern China, and you have worked side by side for 2 years now. The oldest of you, the headman, is already up. He keeps the roll, holds the wages, buys the food, and settles the small disputes. Every gang has one. The company deals with him, and he deals with everything else. Most of you came the same way, on a borrowed ticket. The passage from Hong Kong cost more than a village family sees in a year, so it was advanced on credit and repaid month by careful month out of the first wages earned here. Then the door opens, and you step into something that still surprises you even now. Not weather, a hallway, a corridor carved through the snowpack itself, tall enough to walk upright, glowing with a dim blue morning light that filters down through many feet of snow. The whole camp is connected this way: bunkhouse to cookhouse, cookhouse to blacksmith, blacksmith to the tunnel mouth, all of it laced together by passages in the snow, marked with lanterns, worn smooth by thousands of boots. Some passages lead up toward air shafts and lookout holes. Most lead along from one buried building to the next. Men say you can walk half a mile at Summit Camp without ever seeing the sky, and by February that is simply true. Here and there, a shaft of true daylight falls down a snow well from the surface, kept open with shovels for air. Men pause under these little columns of morning the way cats find sunbeams just for a moment in passing. The cookhouse ahead of you is loud and bright and gloriously warm. Steam rolls off great pots of rice. There is dried fish and vegetables and hot broth, and above all, there is tea, gallons and gallons of tea. You should notice the tea because the tea quietly is one of the secrets of this whole story. Every drop of it was boiled, which means every drop of it was safe in a century when bad water killed more working men than accidents ever did. The other crews on this railroad and on every railroad drink straight from streams and barrels and melted snow, and they suffer for it constantly. Dysentery and typhoid move through their camps like bad weather, and everyone simply accepts it as part of the work. But in the Chinese camps, an old habit from home turns out to be quiet genius. Nobody drinks cold water. Water is for boiling, and tea is for drinking. All day long there will be a boy moving between the cookhouse and the tunnel face, carrying two small kegs on a bamboo pole across his shoulders, keeping every man supplied with warm tea from morning to the end of the shift. The company men noticed early on that these crews stayed on their feet while others sickened, and though the doctors of the era could not fully explain it, the foremen learned to respect it. Breakfast itself would surprise the miners down in the valley towns who live on beans, bread, and salted beef. You eat rice, dried fish, cabbage, a little pork. On good weeks, there are dried oysters and mushrooms, abalone and bamboo shoots, brought up the mountain by Chinese merchants in Sacramento who run supply lines for exactly this purpose, paid for out of the wages your headman holds. Dressing for the tunnel is its own small science worked out over 2 winters. Quilted blue cotton in layers a man can shed as the work warms him. Cloth wrapped at the wrists and palms where the drill steel wears, and the wide basket hat woven from split bamboo that everyone here wears and every photographer loves, which turns out to shed dripping tunnel water and sifting snow better than any felt hat the company store ever sold. It is a better diet, plainly and simply, than almost any other laborer in California eats, and you will need every bit of it. Because now the meal is over, the tin plates are stacking up, and the corridor toward the tunnel is filling with men. It is a little after 6 in the morning, time to go to work inside a mountain. The walk to the portal takes 10 minutes, gently uphill through the snow passages, past the blacksmith shop where the drill steels are sharpened in their hundreds, past the powder store with its careful, respectful distance from everything else, until the blue snow light gives way to timber framing and raw granite. The blacksmith shop is the loudest room on the mountain, and somehow the most cheerful, a cave of orange light where the forges never cool. All day it swallows dull drill steels by the basketful and returns them sharp, hundreds upon hundreds of them, because the granite eats chisel edges the way the men eat rice. The smiths can tell from the wear on a steel which heading it came from and how the rock is running there today. And there it is. The crews call it by its number Tunnel 6. The engineers call it the Summit Tunnel. It is the longest, hardest, most stubborn obstacle on the entire transcontinental route, a bore of 1,659 feet through the granite spine of the Sierra Nevada. Out of the darkness comes the night shift, gray with rock dust, blinking even at lantern light. The work in this tunnel has not stopped day or night in many months. 3 shifts of 8 hours each around the clock, 7 days a week. The mountain does not get holidays, so neither for now do the men. There is a pause at the portal while the bosses count heads and trade reports in 2 languages. How far the night crew got. Which holes are charged. Where the rock is running hard. You know some of these words in English now. Feet, inches, powder, mostly inches. Then you step inside and the world simplifies. The wind stops. The cold softens. The tunnel swallows sound so that the voices behind you fade within a few steps, and what remains is the smell of burnt powder and wet stone and a ceiling of rough granite just above your hat. Some of the men find the tunnel oppressive. You have come over the months to find it almost restful, the way any small, warm, purposeful place can be restful. The work is brutal, but the tunnel itself is calm. Light down here is a supply like powder and rice ordered by the case and guarded by the foreman. Candles burn in little niches carved into the rock, each one wearing a slow beard of wax, and oil lamps hang where the work is finest. The company buys candles by the tens of thousands, and still the tunnel teaches every man to work half by feel, to know his drill hole the way you know a coat button in the dark. After enough months, the men say you stop noticing the darkness at all. You notice instead the one place in the tunnel where it is about to matter. A quarter mile in, you reach the face, the flat wall of granite where the tunnel currently ends, and where all effort in this part of the world is aimed. By lantern light, it looks unremarkable, a gray wall glittering faintly, marked with the dark mouths of drill holes. It has stopped better tools than yours. This particular granite is so dense that when the engineers first tested it, blasting powder sometimes did nothing but cough the charge back out of the hole like a stubborn cork. Your gang splits into its teams without any orders being given. 3 men to a team. One sits at the face holding the drill steel, a rod of iron with a chisel tip. The other 2 stand over him with sledgehammers. There is an etiquette to this, refined over thousands of hours. The holder turns the steel a quarter turn after every blow so the chisel bites fresh rock. The strikers alternate, finding a rhythm as steady as oars on a lake. Trust matters here. A tired striker and an attentive holder and hands get broken. Your team has never broken a hand. And so begins the music that you heard at the very start of tonight, the patient ringing that never stops. Strike, turn. Strike, turn. Rock dust gathers in a little gray cone below the hole. Progress is real, and progress is absurdly small. An hour of this might deepen the hole by a few inches. A full shift of drilling by an entire crew sets up a round of blasting that will advance this end of the tunnel by perhaps 8 inches. 8 inches on a railroad meant to run 1,776 miles. It is worth letting that number settle the way it settled over the men who worked here. 8 inches a day at the hardest headings. The engineers in San Francisco despaired over. The newspapers mocked it. But at the face itself, a different arithmetic takes hold. Nobody at the face thinks about 1,700 miles. They think about this hole, this steel, this turn, then the next. The men who built the impossible railroad did it by declining hour after hour to think about how impossible it was. Mid-morning, the T-boy arrives at the face with his kegs, and the rhythm pauses. Steam curls in the lantern light. Men sit back against the tunnel wall, hands loose around warm cups, and for a few minutes the only sounds are quiet talk and the drip of water somewhere in the dark. Down the tunnel, another team keeps its own rhythm going, so the ringing never quite stops, and by now you would honestly miss it if it did. It is the sound of the day passing. Somewhere above you, storms may be blowing. Down here, there is only the work, the tea, and the slow, stubborn winning of inches. After tea, the charge holes from the night shift are checked, and the morning blasting begins its careful choreography. Black powder is the old, familiar servant of this work, and the Central Pacific consumes it on a scale nobody has ever seen before. Up and down this mountain, across all the tunnels and cuts, the company is burning through as many as 500 kegs of blasting powder every single day, more than entire armies used in whole campaigns. Wagon loads of it creak up the mountain roads all summer, and sled loads all winter, and still the granite asks for more. When a round is fired, the ritual is always the same. Count the men. Count the charges. Fire in sequence, listening carefully, because every explosion must be accounted for before anyone walks back in. A charge that fired late into a crew clearing rubble was the accident every foreman feared most. So you wait in the smoke-smelling dark, counting thumps like a child counting thunder, and only when the numbers agree does the mucking begin, the unglamorous heart of tunnel work, loading broken stone into one-horse carts hour after hour. And then, always, the mucking, the plainest work in the mountain, and the work that never ends, because every blast that wins 8 inches also fills the tunnel floor with tons of shattered stone, and every pound of it must travel out by shovel, basket, and one-horse cart. The cart horse knows the route better than some of the men, walking her line from face to portal without a word of guidance, standing patient at the tip while the rubble goes over the edge of the fill. There is a rhythm to mucking that the crews settle into like rowers, and old hands say you can judge a gang entirely by how it clears its rock. But black powder alone was losing this fight, and so in a small stone building set very deliberately apart from everything else, the Central Pacific keeps a chemist. His name is James Howden, and his job each day is to mix a syrupy, oily liquid that the newspapers have taught everyone to fear: nitroglycerin. It is several times stronger than powder, and it does not so much dislike being disturbed as refuse, unpredictably, to tolerate it. The year before, a crate of it exploded in a Wells Fargo office in San Francisco, and after that, no railroad, no ship, no wagon line would knowingly carry the stuff anywhere. The solution the company settled on tells you everything about this railroad. If nitroglycerin could not be transported, it would be made fresh on the mountain, a few gallons at a time, and carried to the tunnel by hand, on foot, the last distance to the face. The men treat it with a specific, practiced courtesy. Nobody hurries near it. Nobody jokes near it. In Tunnel 6, it earns its keep biting through granite that laughed at powder, nearly doubling the pace at the headings, and the crews come to regard it the way sailors regard the sea, as a power you work with respectfully and never ever turn your back on. Here is the other trick that is beating the mountain, and it is pure geometry. A tunnel dug from its two ends advances at two faces. So the engineer sank a vertical shaft 73 feet straight down from the surface into the middle of the tunnel line, and from the bottom of it, the crews now dig outward in both directions. 4 faces instead of 2, the mountain being eaten from the inside out. All winter, a small steam hoist raises the broken rock up the shaft, bucket by bucket, and lowers men and steel and tea down into the dark. And hanging over all of it is a quiet miracle of measurement. 4 crews digging blind through solid rock from 4 directions, guided by nothing but survey stakes on a stormy summit and small chalk marks by lantern light. If the calculations are wrong by even a little, the bores will slide past each other in the dark, and months of labor will be wasted. When the headings of Tunnel 6 finally meet, the error, after all those months and all that granite, will be measured in fractions of a single inch. The men will talk about it for the rest of their lives. Midday comes to the tunnel the way everything comes to the tunnel, on foot and in baskets. Warm rice, vegetables, more tea, eaten sitting on yesterday's broken granite. There is time to rest the shoulders, time to rewrap a palm, time for the small talk of men who have long since run out of new things to say to each other and are comfortable that way. Someone mentions the storm predicted for tonight. Someone else shrugs. Storms matter on the surface. Down here, the weather never changes. 50 degrees, damp, dark, and honest. The afternoon is the morning again, and that is not a complaint. Strike, turn, strike, turn. The cart horse plods its route from face to portal unbothered, having made a complete peace with underground life. The drill steals dull and are traded for sharp ones, and the dull ones travel back to the blacksmith by the door, so there is always somewhere the far-off musical sound of steel being made ready. You measure the hours the way everyone at the face measures them, in holes. 6 holes for your team today, maybe 7 if the rock stays kind. Nobody has ever gotten rich counting inches, but there is a satisfaction in it that is hard to explain to the men in the offices. The wall in front of you is the actual, literal frontier of the United States railroad system. Every inch you take from it tonight is an inch the whole country moves closer together. There is one more craft practiced on this mountain that deserves a moment of its own because it will outlive everything else. Where the roadbed clings to slopes too steep to hold it, the Chinese crews build retaining walls and culverts out of the granite the blasting provides, and they build them the old way, the way walls are built in the villages of Guangdong. Stone fitted to stone by eye and hand, no mortar at all, each block chosen so the mountain itself locks the wall together. The engineers sign off on them. What the engineers do not yet know is that a century and a half later, long after iron bridges have been replaced twice over, those dry laid walls will still be standing under the modern track, carrying trains heavier than anything the 1860s could imagine, without a bag of cement in any of them. Railroad men will come to call one great fill in the high country simply the Chinese Wall, and hikers will stand in front of these structures wondering correctly whether they are looking at engineering or at sculpture. It is worth saying plainly while the hammers ring what this work pays because it is not nothing and it is not fair both at once. About $31 a month in silver, and you feed yourself out of it. The white workers alongside you make a similar wage, but the company feeds them and boards them for free, which makes their true pay meaningfully higher for the same day underground. Everyone on this mountain knows this arithmetic. The men do not need it explained. Some months from now, that quiet knowledge will surface in a way that stuns the company. And we will come to that part of the story a little later tonight, once we leave the tunnel behind. For now, it goes where it always goes, into the ledger in the headman's memory, unforgotten. While we are on the subject of how people live on this mountain, there is one household here worth a small detour because visitors never fail to mention it. James Strobridge, the one-eyed construction superintendent, does not live in a company office in Sacramento. He lives at the end of track, wherever the end of track happens to be, in a converted rail car that his wife Hannah has turned, by sheer force of will, into a proper Victorian home, with lace curtains at the windows, a canopy porch, potted plants, and a caged canary that has by now crossed most of the Sierra Nevada. Hannah Strobridge raises 6 children in that rolling house, hosts visiting dignitaries at a proper dinner table while blasting echoes down the canyon, and moves house, in the literal sense, every time the railhead moves. The newspapers call her the heroine of the Central Pacific, and the men regard the sight of her curtains at the end of track with a certain fondness. Wherever the canary is, that is where the railroad currently ends. And then, at last, the shift ends the way it began, with a count. Heads at the face, heads at the portal, the day crew flowing out as the evening crew flows in, the ringing behind you never stopping, only changing hands. Your legs are heavy, your palms are humming, and there is gray dust in every fold of your clothing, but the walk back down the snow corridors is one of the reliable pleasures of this life. The lanterns are lit. The cookhouse is somewhere ahead, warming the air, sending the smell of rice and wood smoke down the blue-white halls to meet you. Behind you, the mountain keeps its patient vigil over the men still working. 8 more inches today. The Impossible Railroad is 8 inches longer than it was this morning. And now comes the good part of the day. The first thing waiting at the end of the shift is not dinner. It is hot water. Outside the bunkhouses stand rows of powder kegs and barrels, filled and refilled by the cooks, warmed with water off the same fires that never stop boiling tea, and every man coming off the mountain washes before he does anything else. It is an old habit from home, as ordinary to you as breathing, and it quietly astonishes every observer who visits this camp. The other crews on the railroad wash when the weather suits, which in a Sierra winter means rarely. Here, the day's rock dust goes into the water, the work clothes are changed for clean ones, and a man sits down to his dinner feeling like a person rather than a tool. The company doctors, years later, will point to the baths and the boiled tea when they try to explain something that puzzled everyone at the time, which is that through seasons that broke the health of whole camps, the Chinese crews simply kept on being well. Dinner is the loudest, warmest hour of the buried day. Long tables, benches full, platters coming out of the steam in relays. Rice, always the foundation of everything. Pork and chicken on the good days, dried fish on the ordinary ones, and around them a constellation of things the merchants haul up the mountain in crates: dried oysters, abalone, cuttlefish, bamboo shoots, mushrooms, dried fruit, peanuts, and salted cabbage. The men of your gang pay for this table together out of wages through the headman, and consider the money well spent. Down the valley, an Irish track hand is eating his fourth straight week of boiled beef and bread, and meaning no disrespect to him at all, you would not trade plates. Food from home, in a place this far from home, does something that has nothing to do with nutrition. For half an hour every evening, 30 feet under a foreign mountain, the sounds and the smells around this table are the sounds and smells of Guangdong. It is worth pausing on how all of this food gets here because the supply line is a small marvel of its own. Chinese merchant houses in Sacramento and San Francisco, run by the same district associations that help the men cross the Pacific, operate what amounts to a parallel commissary for the entire workforce. Their agents travel with the camps, take orders through the headman, and send the goods up the mountain by rail as far as rail goes, then by wagon, then in winter by ox-drawn sledge over the snow roads. Crates of dried seafood and tea that began their journey in Canton arrive months later at a cookhouse buried under a Sierra snowdrift, and the books balanced to the penny because the headman checks them. The company, for its part, is quietly delighted with the arrangement. It feeds its largest workforce without lifting a finger. The men eat far better than the company kitchen could manage, and everyone for once agrees the system works. Then comes the soft part of the evening, the two lamplit hours that belong to no company and no mountain. Some of the men settle instantly into games, fan-tan with its little brass coins, dominoes clicking like slow rain, small wagers that mostly just move the same money in circles around the room. A few draw on long pipes and let the smoke wander up into the rafters. Somebody most nights is writing a letter or paying a better lettered man to write one, and the words in it travel a route that would take tonight and every night this week to describe: down the mountain by sled, to Sacramento by rail, to San Francisco by riverboat, and across the whole Pacific Ocean by steamer, to a village where a wife or a mother will hold a page her son touched 5 weeks earlier. Money travels with the letters. Of the $31 a month, a large share goes home, and in the villages of the Pearl River Delta, houses are being repaired, and debts are being retired, and younger brothers are being schooled on wages earned inches at a time inside the Sierra Nevada. And once a week, the mountain lets go of you entirely because Sunday in the camps is honored as a true day of rest. Sunday is for the long wash, clothes boiled and strung on lines down the warmest corridors. Sunday is for the barber who shaves faces and foreheads and rebraids queues with the ceremony of a craftsman, while a line of men waits on a bench trading the week's news between camps. Sunday is for the herb doctor because the larger camps keep one, a man with drawers of dried roots and careful hands who treats the coughs and the strained backs and the rheumatism this altitude hands out freely in a tradition already old when Rome was young. And Sunday is for visiting camp to camp along the snow corridors and the plowed paths, a slow circulation of cousins and village neighbors across the whole buried settlement, so that by evening every camp knows who got a letter, who won at Fantan, and what the foremen are saying about the rock. The company observes all this with a kind of baffled approval. Its workforce returns to the tunnel on Monday clean, rested, doctored, and solvent, which is more than most railroads of the era could say for theirs. Once a year, deep in the worst of the winter, the buried camp does something better than rest. It celebrates. The Lunar New Year arrives in late January or February, the exact bottom of the Sierra winter, and the crews keep it properly. Red paper goes up on the bunkhouse posts. The cooks outdo themselves for days. Offerings are set out for ancestors on the far side of an ocean. Debts between men are settled so the year can start clean, and strings of firecrackers hauled up the mountain in the merchant crates for exactly this night crackle and echo strangely down the snow corridors, their smoke curling up through the air shafts into the storm. The sound carries oddly through 40 feet of snowpack, and there is something wonderful in the picture of it. The highest, coldest, most isolated place in America, sealed under a Sierra blizzard, quietly full of lantern light and feast smells, and the oldest holiday its inhabitants know. Even the foremen come by for the food. Tomorrow the drills ring again. Tonight, under the mountain, it is simply New Year, same as it is at home. While the games go on, the storm the men mentioned at midday arrives overhead. On the surface, it is a world no one could stand upright in, wind screaming across the summit, snow moving horizontally, the temperature falling through the floor. This winter, the winter of 1866 into 67, will be remembered as one of the worst in the recorded history of these mountains. The camp will count 44 separate storms before spring. Some will last 5 days without pausing. The snow they leave behind does not melt. It accumulates layer upon layer until drifts stand higher than a 4-story building. And this, truthfully, is why the camp lives buried. Not as a stunt, but as the only sensible response the mountain left available. You cannot keep 1,000 cabins clear of 40 feet of snow. You can let the snow come and tunnel through it and let it become your insulation, your windbreak, and your roof. Underneath it, on a night like this, the bunkhouse is warm and the lamps barely flicker. The storm is a rumor. You hear it the way you hear the ocean in a shell, far away, muffled, almost soothing. Down the mountain, on the stretches of finished track below the camps, the company is fighting the same storm with machinery and mostly losing. It has built enormous wedge plows, buckers, great wooden battering rams taller than the locomotives themselves, and on bad mornings 5 or 6 engines are coupled behind one, backed up a mile, and driven at the drifts at full steam again and again like a hammer against the winter. Passengers write home about the spectacle, the boom of the impact, the snow flying higher than the telegraph poles. But a bucker cannot argue with a drift hardened to ice or with a slide that refills a cut an hour after it is cleared, and there are weeks this winter when the finished railroad simply stops, buried as deep as the camps. The lesson is being written in snow all winter, in letters 40 feet tall. It is not enough to build a railroad over these mountains. Something will have to stand over the track itself. Hold that thought until later tonight, because the answer, when it comes, will be one of the strangest structures in America. But it would be wrong, and the men themselves would say it is wrong, to tell this night as if the snow were only a blanket. The snow was also the danger no courage could argue with. On slopes above the tunnel portals and the open cuts, storm upon storm loads the mountainside until, some unknowable moment, it lets go. Avalanches came without pattern and without mercy, and in these winters they took whole crews at once, sometimes from inside buildings, sometimes from the very corridors that made the buried camp feel safe. Some of the missing were not found until the thaw, months later, and the discoveries were spoken of quietly all across the mountain, men still standing together, tools still in hand, the snow having simply stopped their world in an instant. The camp mourned in its own way, sent wages and letters home, and went back into the tunnel because the tunnel, strange as it sounds, was the one place the avalanches could not reach. No one who worked this summit ever romanticized the snow again. They respected it, planned around it, and counted the days until April. Slowly, the evening burns down to its embers. The games break up, the coins are pocketed, the last letters are folded. Men bank the stove, check their boots one final time, and climb into bunks in the same unhurried order they do everything. Someone always falls asleep first, and someone always snores first, and there is always one lamp that stays lit a little longer than the others, over a man who is mending a jacket or finishing a thought. Then that lamp goes out too. Listen to the camp now. 2,000 men breathing slowly, 30 feet down, warm under a mountain of snow, while the storm walks back and forth overhead looking for them and never finding them. Far off, if you strain, you can just hear it, steel on stone, faint as a heartbeat. The night shift, winning inches in the dark. It is the last sound of the day here, and the first sound, and it is strangely good to sleep to. And that, from the stove door in the dark to the last lamp, is a single ordinary day at Summit Camp, one of hundreds these men will spend inside this mountain. Tomorrow will be the same day, and the day after, until the granite gives up. Which leaves the real question hanging in the lamplit dark, the one this whole story turns on. How did they come to be here at all? How did 15,000 young men from the far side of the Pacific end up holding the fate of an American railroad in their hands in the highest snow on the continent? To answer that properly, we need to leave the camp sleeping and go back about 8 years to a country that was tearing itself in half and a young engineer whom everyone in California called crazy. Picture the United States in 1860 from high above, the way a map maker would. In the east, railroads lie across the land like a cast net, thousands of miles of them, linking every city worth naming. And then, just past the Missouri River, the net simply stops. Beyond it stretches 1,700 miles of plains, deserts, and mountain ranges, crossed by no track at all. California is already a state rich with gold and grain, but it hangs off the far edge of the continent like an island. To reach it, an American family faces a choice of ordeals: 5 to 6 months by wagon, walking beside the oxen most of the way, or weeks at sea by way of Panama, where travelers cross the isthmus through fever country and pray their connecting steamer actually arrives. A letter from New York to San Francisco can take a month. The two halves of the country know each other mostly by rumor. Nearly everyone agrees a Pacific Railroad would change everything, and nearly everyone agrees it cannot be built because standing in its path near the California end is a wall of granite 2 miles high called the Sierra Nevada. Congress has debated the idea for a decade and produced exactly nothing. It is going to take somebody unreasonable. The unreasonable somebody is a young engineer named Theodore Judah, and even the people who love him find him exhausting. He has built California's first railroad, a modest line out of Sacramento, but his conversation returns so reliably to a transcontinental railroad that people in the street call him Crazy Judah. What separates him from every other dreamer is that he goes and does the tedious part. Summer after summer, Judah rides into the Sierra with instruments and notebooks, measuring, rejecting route after route, until at last, guided by a storekeeper from a mountain town called Dutch Flat, he finds the one geological accident he needs, a long continuous ridge climbing toward Donner Pass, where a line can ascend the entire wall of the Sierra on grades a locomotive can actually manage. He draws it, surveys it, and prices it. Then he finds money where the great banks refuse to look, in 4 Sacramento merchants, a grocer, a dry goods man, and 2 hardware dealers, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. Shopkeepers buying a mountain range. And in 1862, with the Civil War raging and the South absent from Congress, Abraham Lincoln signs the Pacific Railway Act. 2 companies are chartered. The Central Pacific will build east from Sacramento. The Union Pacific will build west from the Missouri River. Where they meet is left fatefully undecided, and both companies will be paid by the government per mile of finished track. Read that clause the way the builders read it. Every mile you lay is a mile the other company cannot have. It is not a construction project. It is a race. It is worth sitting for a moment with how absurd this partnership looked from the outside, because all of San Francisco certainly did. The great capitalists of the coast, the bankers and shipping magnates, examined Judah's Mountain Railroad and declined it as politely as one declines a lunatic. The men who said yes ran stores. Stanford sold groceries and wine. Huntington and Hopkins sold shovels and stoves. Crocker sold bolts of cloth. Their combined railroad experience was riding on trains. What they had instead was a merchant's instinct that the mathematics of a captive transcontinental route would eventually make its owners rich beyond argument, and the stomach to wait years for it. The city wits called the enterprise the Dutch Flat Swindle, insisting the shopkeepers never meant to cross the Sierra at all, only to build far enough to capture the wagon road tolls to the Nevada silver mines and quietly stop. The accusation followed the company for years, printed and reprinted, right up until the day Tunnel 6 went through the summit, at which point it evaporated, unapologized for, the way such accusations do. The Central Pacific breaks ground at Sacramento in January of 1863, with speeches and bunting and a crowd standing in the mud, and then reality arrives almost immediately. The first miles across the valley floor are easy, but money is desperately short. The war has inflated the price of everything, and every rail, every spike, every locomotive must be manufactured in the East and shipped around the entire South American continent, a voyage of months before it can be laid in California. And the company discovers it has a labor problem that borders on comedy, if it were not so ruinous. It advertises for 5,000 workers. It gets a few hundred, and even they keep leaving because the same mountains the railroad must cross are full of silver strikes, and a man hired in Sacramento often rides the work train to the end of track, eats the company's dinner, and walks on toward the mines by morning. Theodore Judah does not live to see any of it solved. In the autumn of 1863, crossing Panama on yet another money-raising voyage east, he contracts yellow fever and dies at 43, with not one rail yet laid across his mountain. His widow, Anna, who had hand-painted the illustrations in his survey reports and believed in the route as fiercely as he did, carried his papers home, and lived another 4 decades, long enough to see trains cross Donner Pass on the exact line her husband drew. The company he founded named a mountain peak for him near the pass, and then, less kindly, mostly stopped saying his name. The railroad that will shortly astonish the world enters its great crisis absolutely leaderless on the ground, short of cash, short of men, and staring up at the granite. The first true test of everyone's resolve comes early, in the foothills near Auburn, at a place the crews learn to hate and engineers still make pilgrimages to. The surveyed line runs through a ridge of ancient gravel cemented as hard as poor concrete, and rather than climb it, the company decides to go through it, straight through a cut 63 feet deep and 800 feet long, excavated entirely by black powder, pick, and wheelbarrow. They call it Bloomer Cut, and it consumes months. The material is too hard to dig and too loose to tunnel, so it must be blasted down in layers and carried out barrow by barrow, and it is here that Construction Superintendent James Strobridge, leaning in to inspect a charge that had hung fire, loses an eye to a delayed explosion, a wound he will carry, along with his opinion that the work is dangerous, for the rest of the project. When it is finally done, the newspapers call Bloomer Cut the eighth wonder of the world, with the endearing confidence of a decade that had not yet seen what this railroad would do next. Trains still run through it today between the same walls. As a first lesson in what the Sierra would cost, it could hardly have been clearer, and the granite above was harder than the gravel by an order of magnitude. The solution begins, like many historic things, as an argument born of desperation. By early 1865, the construction chief, Charles Crocker, is missing thousands of workers he cannot hire, and he proposes an idea considered radical in California at the time. There are tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants in the state, most of them young men from the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong, who came for the gold rush and stayed to face laws and prejudices designed to squeeze them out of the mines. Hire them, Crocker says. His own construction superintendent, James Strobridge, flatly resists, repeating the conventional wisdom of the day that men averaging perhaps 120 pounds cannot do heavy railroad work. The counter-argument, which Crocker reportedly delivered with a shrug, has since become famous. They built the Great Wall of China, did they not? In February of 1865, roughly 50 Chinese workers are taken on frankly as an experiment and are handed picks and shovels and, one suspects, very low expectations. Within weeks, the experiment is over. Their grading is neat, their pace is relentless, their camps are orderly, and they do not vanish to the silver mines. Strobridge, to his credit, surrenders to the evidence. The company begins hiring every Chinese worker in California, then contracts recruiting agents to bring men directly from Guangdong itself, whole villages of cousins and brothers crossing the Pacific toward wages unimaginable at home. By the height of construction, 10 to 15,000 Chinese workers are on the Central Pacific payroll, 9 of every 10 men on the line. The number in the title of tonight's story is not a rounding error. The Transcontinental Railroad's western half was, by simple head count, built overwhelmingly by the men you spent this evening with under the snow. And now the company that once doubted they could swing a pick was about to ask them for something far harder. It was about to point them at the granite. The assault on the Sierra opens at a place the survey crews named Cape Horn, where the route must round a great shoulder of mountain 1,200 feet above the American River on a slope too steep to stand on carelessly. There is no tunnel here. What is needed is a ledge, a shelf for the railroad carved into the side of the gorge, and it must be cut by hand with picks, black powder, and one-horse carts, by men working where a stumble means falling most of a quarter mile. This is the spot where the most famous single image of the whole construction was born, the story of Chinese workers lowered from the cliff tops in woven baskets to drill and charge the rock face. And here, since tonight we have told you only true things, honesty is owed. Historians who have combed the company records and the newspapers of those years find no first-hand account of baskets at Cape Horn. The slope, they note, is fearfully steep, but not the sheer wall of the paintings, and the likelier truth is workers roped for safety on terrible ground, which was dangerous enough to need no embroidery. The basket story may be a legend that grew in the telling, as stories on this railroad tended to. What no one disputes is what remains. Between 1865 and 66, Chinese crews carved that ledge around Cape Horn. Trains still run on their roadbed today, and passengers still crowd to the windows above the gorge, mostly unaware they are riding on handmade ground. From there, the line climbed into the high country, and the company asked its workforce to spend the winters we have already lived through together, buried at the summit, ringing steel against Tunnel 6. You know that part. You were there. What you have not yet heard is what those same men did in the spring of 1867, once the worst winter was behind them, and it may be the most quietly remarkable episode of the entire story. In June of 1867, along the whole snowbound crest of the Sierra, the ringing stopped. 3,000 Chinese workers, the tunnel crews, and the graders of the High Line set down their tools together, walked back to their camps, and declined to work. It was, by the count of labor historians, one of the largest strikes anywhere in America in that era, and beyond question the largest by Chinese workers, and it was conducted with a discipline that unnerved the company more than any riot could have. There was no violence, no destruction, no shouting in the cuts. The demands passed through the headmen were arithmetic itself. Wages of $40 a month. A workday shortened toward what the outside crews worked, especially the brutal shifts in the tunnels. In plain words, the pay and hours of the white men working beside them. Charles Crocker was rattled, and his response was cold and simple. The camps at the summit ate food carted up the mountain, so he stopped the carts. For a week, high in the thinning supplies, the strikers held together, and the company, whose entire race against the Union Pacific was frozen solid, sweated in Sacramento. In the end, the strike broke on hunger, as the company knew it must, and the men returned without their formal demands. But the ending is not quite the moral of it. Wages on the Central Pacific rose afterward, quietly, the way concessions are made by men who will not say the word concession. The company never again pretended its workforce was passive, and the workers had discovered and demonstrated exactly how much of the impossible railroad rested on their shoulders alone. 2 months later, in August of 1867, Tunnel 6 broke through, the headings meeting inside the mountain within the width of a thumb. The spine of the Sierra was beaten, and the Central Pacific, desperate for miles, had already begun one of the strangest maneuvers in railroad history, dismantling locomotives at the snow line and hauling them on great ox-drawn sledges over the unfinished summit to lay track down the far side while the tunnels were still being cut behind them. Victory over the granite still left the company one enemy standing, the same one you slept beneath in the first half of tonight, and the answer to the snow became one of the strangest structures in America. If the line over the summit could not be kept clear, it would be covered, and so through the summers that followed, whole armies of carpenters raised timber galleries over the track itself, mile after mile after mile of them, sheds strong enough to let avalanches pass clean over the rails and the trains beneath. By the time they finished, there were nearly 40 miles of them, built from 65 million feet of lumber, snaking along the cliffs and cuts of the high country, and passengers complained, in the charming way of passengers, that the finest mountain scenery on the continent was now viewed in flickers between posts from inside what railroad men called the longest barn in the world. The sheds caught fire from locomotive sparks, were rebuilt, rotted, were rebuilt again, and pieces of that system stood and served for a full century. Meanwhile, with the summit conquered and sheathed, the Central Pacific came down the eastern slope like water finally over a dam. The crews who had averaged inches in Tunnel 6 hit the Nevada flats and discovered what they could do with easy ground, a mile of track a day, then more. The supply trains hard behind them, the men who had lived under the snow now working under desert sun, and the race across the Great Basin at long last truly began. All this while, 1,000 miles to the east, the other half of the race is thundering across an entirely different world. The Union Pacific, building west from Omaha, has no granite wall to fight. It has distance, oceans of it, the open plains, and it attacks them with speed the newspapers can actually watch. Its workforce is its own portrait of the American moment. Thousands of Irish immigrants, veterans of both the Union and Confederate armies, laying rail side by side 3 years after shooting at each other, freed black men moving west for wages, and, in Utah ahead, Mormon crews grading under contract for both companies at once. The system that drives them is the invention of two brothers named Casement, a rolling work train, a factory on wheels, dormitories, kitchens, blacksmith shops, and a mile of supplies creeping along the fresh track while crews ahead of it swing rails off horse-drawn carts in a rhythm visitors describe like music. On the best ground, the Union Pacific lays 2, 3, 4 miles of track in a day, and trailing the end of track like a carnival comes the infamous string of instant towns, Julesburg, Cheyenne, Laramie, hammered up in weeks, saloons and gambling tents and false front hotels, christened Hell on Wheels, then folded and dragged forward when the railhead moved on. It is loud, fast, frequently lawless, and driven by the same per-mile arithmetic as the West End. It also runs straight through lands the Lakota and Cheyenne had been promised and have not surrendered, and the collision of the railroad with the peoples of the plains is its own long, grave story, one we will treat gently tonight and not pretend was anything other than grave. By 1868, the two railroads are sprinting at each other across Nevada and Utah, and the race has become so literal and so profitable per mile that their grading crews incredibly pass one another going opposite directions, cutting parallel roadbeds side by side across the same desert because Congress has still not said where the two halves must meet. Somewhere ahead of both companies, that answer is waiting, and with it, a spike made of gold. The plains, it should be said, do not stay easy forever. In Wyoming, the Union Pacific must climb over the granite hump of the Laramie Mountains at Sherman Summit, for years the highest point on any railroad on Earth, and just beyond it the line meets a gorge that produces the most alarming structure on the entire route, the Dale Creek Bridge, a spidery lattice of timber 700 feet long and 130 feet high, so light-looking that passengers routinely refused to believe it would hold, and so alive in the wind that trains crossed it at walking pace while the whole web hummed. It held. It always held. But it made the point, to anyone still keeping score, that the eastern half of this race was paying its own tolls in nerve. The last winter of the race is fought in the canyons of Utah, and it acquires a genuine strangeness that no novelist would dare invent. The Union Pacific, behind schedule and nearly out of money, blasts its way down Echo and Weber canyons through the worst months of the year, crews working by bonfire light, while Brigham Young, seeing which way the future ran, contracts thousands of Mormon farmers to grade the roadbed through their own valleys, quiet, orderly crews who scandalize the railroad men by neither drinking nor swearing and finish their sections early. And because Congress still has not fixed the meeting point, and every graded mile is money, the two companies simply refuse to stop when they meet. For something like 200 miles across northern Utah, their grading crews work past each other in opposite directions on parallel roadbeds, sometimes only a few dozen feet apart, each company building a railroad the other's trains will never use. The absurdity turns dangerous where the lines cross terrain that must be blasted. Powder shots from one grade rain rock down on the other, and the Central Pacific crews, most of them the same men who had cut Tunnel 6, learned to watch the Union Pacific slopes above them the way they once watched for avalanches. It takes the federal government itself in the spring of 1869 to end the farce, fixing the junction at last at a bare summit of sagebrush north of the Great Salt Lake, and turning both companies from rivals into neighbors with suddenly nothing left to race for. The final year of the race is run across the Nevada and Utah desert, and it is run at a pace no railroad had ever attempted. Water for men and locomotives alike travels in tank cars because the land offers none worth drinking. Track goes down a mile a day, then two, then three. The Central Pacific crews, hardened by 4 years of granite, finding the flat ground almost restful. And it is here, in the last month of the race, that the whole enterprise produces its signature feat of pure showmanship. Charles Crocker has boasted that his men can lay 10 miles of track in a single day, and the Union Pacific Vice President, Thomas Durant, bets him $10,000 that they cannot. On the morning of April 28, 1869, with the Union Pacific too close to their own end of track to answer whatever happens, the Central Pacific plays its hand. It is planned like a military operation. 8 chosen rail handlers, Irishmen whose names the company proudly recorded, lift and place every rail that day, while behind and around them a supporting army of some 4,000 workers. The overwhelming majority of them Chinese moves ties, spikes, fish plates, and bolts forward in a continuous rehearsed stream. 5 ties to the rail, 3 strokes to the spike, water and tea circulating so no man stops moving. When the foremen call time at the end of the working day, the crews have laid 10 miles and 56 feet of finished railroad. Locomotives run over it that evening as proof. The 8 rail handlers have each lifted, by the company arithmetic, well over 100 tons of iron. No hand-laying crew on earth ever beat the mark, and none ever will, because the age that could produce such a day is about to end 12 miles up the line. The meeting point decreed at last by Congress is a treeless basin of sagebrush north of the Great Salt Lake called Promontory Summit, and on the 10th of May, 1869, the two halves of the country are finally close enough to touch. 2 locomotives face each other across one last gap in the rails, the Central Pacific engine Jupiter and the Union Pacific 119, while perhaps 600 people, officials, soldiers, photographers, track hands, gather in the mud and sun. A laurel wood tie is laid. Ceremonial spikes are presented, one of silver and one famously of gold, engraved with the prayer that God might continue the unity of the country as the railroad now united its 2 great oceans. The telegraph operators have wired spike and hammer alike into the national network, so that when the last blow falls it will be heard as clicks in every telegraph office in America, the first live national broadcast in the history of the country. Leland Stanford swings, and the story has always insisted, misses striking the rail while the crowd roars with laughter and a track hand quietly finishes the job. The wire flashes one word east and west. Done. In San Francisco and New York, the cannons begin. In Chicago, the crowds pour into the streets. And in Philadelphia, they ring the Liberty Bell. And there is one more detail from that day easy to miss in the celebration that this particular story is obliged to keep. The honor of laying the very last rail was given by the Central Pacific to a crew of Chinese workers. One of the officers present wrote that the ground they finished that morning ended a road begun by their hands in Sacramento 6 years and nearly 700 miles of mountain and desert before. In the most famous photograph of the day, the champagne picture, the 2 engines nearly kissing, the crowd thick between them, you will look a long time to find those men. They had built the western half of the thing being celebrated, and at the moment of celebration they are all but invisible. Remember that. Tonight was, in its small way, an attempt to develop that photograph properly. And with that single word done, the country simply changes size. The journey that consumed 5 to 6 months by wagon, that killed with cholera and river crossings and early snow, becomes 7 days in a seat, about $65 in coach. A letter crosses the continent in a week. California fruit appears on New York tables. 60 years earlier, Lewis and Clark had needed a year and a half to reach the Pacific. A family now made the trip between 2 Sundays, sleeping through the plains that had broken generations of oxen, and the American West, for better and often for worse, is thrown open. The men who built it scatter the way work crews always scatter. The Irish veterans drift into the next railroads, and there will be many, because America, having built one transcontinental line, immediately begins 4 more. The Chinese crews of the Central Pacific discharged by the thousands at Promontory with no train ticket owed them walk and work their way outward across the West, and it is their hands over the following decades that build great stretches of the Southern Pacific, the Northern Pacific, the railroads of Texas, the levees of the Sacramento Delta. The granite crews of Tunnel 6 become quietly the infrastructure workforce of half the continent right up until the year 13 years after the Golden Spike, when Congress passes a law with an unambiguous name, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the country that their railroad stitched together closes its door on their countrymen. That is a story for another wider awake night. Tonight we will simply see our crew home to their evening fires and let the record show plainly who built what. And what was it actually like, that first ride across the continent? That depended, as most things did, on the ticket. At the top of the trade rode the Pullman Palace cars, rolling hotels of polished walnut and plush, with fold-down berths made up nightly with linen, oil chandeliers, porters, and dining service that newspapers described in the tones normally reserved for ocean liners. First class Omaha to Sacramento cost around $100, and the passengers treated the week as a scenic cruise, guidebooks in hand, crowding to the left side windows on schedule when the conductor announced the 1,000-foot drop at Cape Horn, mostly unaware they were admiring a ledge carved by hand by men paid $31 a month. Behind them rode second class on plainer seats for about $75, and behind that, for $40, came the immigrant car's wooden benches, a stove at one end, families cooking their own food and sleeping sitting up, or on boards laid between the seats, for a slower journey that might stretch to 10 days on the sidings, waiting for every faster train to pass. It was crowded, smoky, loud, and cheap, and it was also, by every measure that had governed human movement across this continent since the beginning, a miracle. The $40 bench crossed in a week and a half the same country that had taken the wagon families half a year and a portion of their graves. People wrote home about the boredom. Imagine, wrote one, being bored crossing Nevada. Their grandparents could not have imagined either half of the sentence. So that is how you build an impossible railroad. Not with a secret and not quickly. You build it the way the man you woke up with this morning built it, 1/4 turn of a drill steel at a time, 8 inches a day, under 40 feet of snow, with hot tea and a steady crew and a stubborn refusal to consider the whole distance at once. If you drive over Donner Summit today on the interstate, you can park and walk a little way and stand inside Tunnel 6 itself, abandoned now to hikers and swallows. The drill marks are still in the walls. Run a hand over them and you are touching the exact inches won by lantern light that you fell asleep to tonight. And if you are already drifting, then let that be the ending and sleep well. But if you are still with me, stay a little longer. There are 2 short stories left, the kind that only get told after the party is over, about what happened to the golden place where the rails met, and about the men whose names we owe and mostly cannot pay. Here's the strange, sad, quietly hopeful epilogue about names. The Central Pacific kept payrolls, of course, but for its Chinese workforce, the clerks mostly recorded only the headmen, the gang leaders through whom wages flowed. Page after page reads like an intentional fog, one name and then the words in gang, 12 men, 20 men, invisible behind their foreman. Of the 10 to 15,000 Chinese men who built the western half of the first Transcontinental Railroad, the men of the baskets that probably were ropes, the men of the snow corridors and the 8-hour granite shifts. History preserved the full names of only a few hundred. The rest sent their wages home and finished the road and dispersed into the West, and their grandchildren grew up on family stories that the official record could not confirm. It stayed that way for a century and a half. Then, in the years around the railroad's 150th anniversary, universities and family historians and the descendants themselves began an effort to develop that fogged photograph, gathering payroll fragments, village records in Guangdong, letters and memories, recovering the workers name by name like track being relayed in the opposite direction. And in May of 2019, at Promontory itself, where their great great grandfathers had been all but cropped out of the champagne picture, hundreds of those descendants stood in the front rows of the sesquicentennial, and this time the speeches were about them, and this time the photographs made sure. If your eyes are closed now, that is a fine image to hold. The record patched at last, one name at a time, at 8 inches a day. And what became of Promontory, the little sagebrush basin where the continent was joined? Almost nothing, and that is the loveliest part. The instant town that sprang up around the junction lasted only as long as the junction mattered. Within months, the companies moved their transfer point away, and in 1904, the railroad itself built a shortcut, a great causeway straight across the Great Salt Lake, and the main line abandoned the summit entirely. Promontory faded to a siding, then to a ghost. In 1942, the old rails over the pass were ceremonially pulled up for wartime scrap, an undriving of the spike, attended by a small crowd saying goodbye to the 19th century. The golden spike itself had long since gone to a university museum where it rests today. And that might have been the end, except that places where the world once changed do not stay forgotten. The basin is now a National Historical Park, and on summer mornings, two gleaming working replicas of Jupiter and Engine 119 steam slowly out of their shed and stand nose to nose on a short stretch of relayed track, in the middle of a silence so wide you can hear their boilers breathe. There are no cities out there, no monuments crowding for attention, just sage and wind, and two bright locomotives touching noses at the exact spot, which somehow says it better than any statue could. The country rushed on. The place where it learned to rush stayed slow. One last small story for whoever is still awake about how much of tonight you can actually go and touch. More of this railroad survives than almost any other work of its century. At Donner Summit, the modern trains long ago moved to a newer bore, and Tunnel 6 now stands open and unlit, a public place of pilgrimage you can walk end to end with a flashlight through air that still smells faintly of stone and water, past walls where the hand drill marks run in their thousands, and the smoke of the old locomotive still blacks the ceiling. Above it, on the exposed granite, you can find the anchor points of the vanished snow sheds, and nearby the fitted stones of the Chinese wall still carrying the mountain exactly as placed. Down the western slope, the trains of the Union Pacific, which swallowed the Central Pacific a century after the race, still roll around the ledge at Cape Horn every day on the roadbed of 1866. In Utah, you can drive a gravel loop along the parallel grades where the two companies built past each other, two long, quiet scars side by side in the sage, slowly becoming geology. And everywhere along the route in these last years, new plaques and monuments have been going up, in English and in Chinese, at the tunnels and the walls and the summit passes, correcting politely and permanently a century of captions that forgot to say who built what. The railroad, it turns out, was the easy thing to finish. The story took 150 years longer, and you have just heard the finished version. And so we end where we began tonight, high on the old summit, under the stars, over the snow. The snow sheds are gone, the camps are meadows, and the fastest trains cross the mountains a few miles south of Theodore Judah's stubborn ridge. But the ledge at Cape Horn still carries trains, the tunnel still stands open-handed to hikers, and somewhere under all of it, if you listen the way you have listened tonight, there is that patient sound, steel and stone, strike and turn, the sound of 15,000 men building the thing that could not be built, 8 inches at a time. Thank you for spending this night in their company. May your own mountains yield gently and your inches add up. Good night and sleep well.